think everybody's here though. Okay. Small class. All right, real quick, just for the cadets, if you want after class, you can come by. Obviously, one at a time. I can't have 5 of you there at once for the PSB Form 16s. It's more convenient for you to just come by. You can do that then, or you can come by otherwise during those hours I outlined. So. All right, so last week we kind of wrapped up giving kind of a summary of kind of the different eras of the Vietnam War, kind of the early days from 1964 to 1968. Does anybody remember what major kind of operation was rolling during that time?
Rolling Thunder.
I did something yesterday in the 100 class where I just answered my own questions. Okay, and then the next kind of period of time, 1968 to 1972, what did we refer to that period as?
Linebacker.
Linebacker 1 was 1972, but what was kind of the U.S. policy in Vietnam during that time? Remember Nixon was president? Okay, Vietnamization. What was that?
Giving more of the war to the South Vietnamese.
Okay.
Kind of take control back after that.
Okay, very good. We'll talk about it later this semester, but we kind of did the same thing in Iraq. I like to refer to that as the Iracification. That word has been trademarked by me. So all I got to do is write a book, and I'll make lots of money off of that. Very good. So kind of handing more of the war over to the Vietnamese from 1968 to 1972. And then in spring 1972, what major event happened? What did the North do? North Vietnamese?
Easter Offensive.
Okay, very good. The Easter Offensive, which in essence was a large conventional invasion of the South. So what did the United States do in response? Kennedy, I know it's on the tip of your tongue.
In response to dictation.
What was that?
In response to Eastern dictation?
The Easter Offensive.
Easter offensive.
Not a big deal.
They decided to like bomb them horrendously after that, which like the war wasn't really over, that they actually still could fight, and that we were going to win. We had to get rid of all those policies to stop us from bombing their airports, their factories, and such.
Okay, so that was kind of like the secondary effect. Initially, we redeployed a bunch of fighter aircraft bombers to basically to the region. We picked up Linebacker 1. So initially that was to slow the Vietnamese, North Vietnamese advance. It was an interdiction campaign, cutting off those supplies and troops from reaching the south. That kind of continued on for the rest of 1972 until December 1972 when President Nixon decided that these peace talks were going nowhere. So he suspended peace talks and started what operation? It was right after Linebacker 1.
Linebacker 2.
Very good. It's very difficult. Good job, Wayne. So, Linebacker 2, that was kind of more of the one. Yes, we were starting to attack more targets in the north during Linebacker 1, trying to force those peace talks. However, December 1972, Linebacker 2 was when we kind of really went more no holds bar, kind of fought the war more on our terms, kind of forced North Vietnamese to reach a ceasefire. So we're going to talk a lot more about that today. We're going to finish kind of talking about the different aircraft and the different missions that we flew in the war. I know it's been a couple weeks since we watched the video, but we'll just kind of give a good summary of these. So we talked about interdiction, which somebody remind us what interdiction is. What does that mission describe? Somebody else.
Like strategically bombing production places or like roads and transportation.
Okay, yep, kind of more of the roads and transportation. Not necessarily strategic bombing. It could be strategic bombing. It could be more kind of tactical, just, instead of, kind of big objectives, it could be small tactical objectives like just stopping, that convoy of trucks from reaching this small battlefield. So Again, it could be just anything cutting off supplies or troops or vehicles for each of them. So I think we started talking about this slide last week. Some of the different aircraft there. So the F-4 Phantom, that's an aircraft we kind of heard repeating kind of throughout our Vietnam lectures, the F-4 Phantom. For those of you who might be down at Maxwell Air Force Base this summer, you're going to see an F-4 Phantom. What's pretty cool about that F-4 Phantom down there, and you can use this as a story to tell your flight, is Captain Paeth knows the old crew chief on that aircraft. So he was one of my tech school instructors. He helped basically rebuild the aircraft, and then after the aircraft got retired, they moved it down to Maxwell Air Force Base. Made it all pretty for everybody to see for all time. So pretty cool. Then the F-100 Super Sabre, the F-105 Thunder Chief Thud is what it's known as. Anybody know why it was called the Thud? No. That's a good guess, but incorrect. The reason they called it the Thud was initially, kind of in the early days of Vietnam, when it was going out on these Rolling Thunder missions, it was shot down a lot. And that was kind of the thought, the noise they kind of attributed to crashing. So kind of a sick, twisted nickname for it. And then you saw kind of in the video too, the B-52s were outfitted. Primarily, the B-52s were introduced in the 1950s just as that strategic bomber to drop nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union. But we were able to outfit it with the ability to carry a huge payload of just normal go boom kind of bombs, conventional bombs. So, and then see there, arc light. That's just kind of the nickname they gave to the B-52 missions. So, largely B-52s were flying out of Guam. So, if any of you ever end up on Guam someday, there's a nice big B-52 on display there. They have a park called Arc Light Park. So that's kind of cool. I wish I had a picture of it to show you.
Did they ever consider using nuclear bombs?
No, not really during this war. Hard to say, but really during the Korean War, General Douglas MacArthur, Commander-in-Chief of all UN forces in Korea, he was kind of going, advocating to the president and leadership in Washington D.C. Hey, we can end this Korean War real quick. We can get, expel the Chinese out of the Korean Peninsula too. If we just use some well-placed tactical nuclear weapons, so kind of smaller nuclear bombs, and that didn't go over so well. MacArthur was actually fired. Again, I think once we used it in World War II, nobody ever really wanted to ever use it again because we really saw not only the devastating effects of the bomb, but kind of the aftermath in the years following, all the effects of radiation. So those were some of the aircraft used. Again, none of these aircraft necessarily were exclusive just to that mission, which we'll kind of show you here with some of the other missions. So close air support. I think we started talking about this last week. So again, close air support. One of the big roles of the U.S. Air Force in Vietnam was supporting ground troops. Remember, it was largely a ground war because we were fighting not only the North Vietnamese Army, but more primarily our focus was the Viet Cong in the south. So the guerrilla fighters, the ununiformed militiamen, communists in the south. So you see some different aircraft up there. Remember the F designator, like F4, F100, that means fighter. So they're primarily air-to-air type aircraft. Those are aircraft, they're considered attack aircraft, specifically aimed at targeting either troops or targets on the ground. So kind of see some different ones. We actually had some propeller-driven aircraft. You see there with the A1 Sky Raider. I forgot to ask who's seen We Were Soldiers in here? Okay, a few of you. So you actually kind of saw that aircraft in action in that movie when they were calling in the close air strikes within 100 yards of U.S. troops on the ground. So, and then you saw we had our gunships. So AC-47s. good example of that where we outfitted old cargo aircraft with cannons, machine guns. They were able to just kind of slowly orbit with their left wing pointed down at the ground, hitting targets. So very much like the AC-130. So we've seen the original Transformers from about 10 years ago. Yeah, where Tyrese calls in, got the bringing it hot or whatever. I forget what he says. Nobody.
Like the first one?
Not 1980s. I'm talking like early 2000s.
The first one.
Yeah.
The Shia LaBeouf.
Yeah. He said, "Bring the rain." Yeah, Tyrese, bring the rain. That's what he said. Okay, we digress. And then we talked about the use of forward air controllers. So a lot of those guys flying those slow Cessnas originally early on in the war, marking targets for faster moving aircraft. But all this was not possible without. Sorry, we also had the B-52. I skipped this slide. Kind of not a traditional role for the B-52. So B-52's primary role in the world was, strategic bombing, with nuclear weapons. We outfitted it with bombs so we could do interdiction missions, but also they could be used for close air support. So, with the advent of air-to-air refueling, B-52s could essentially kind of loiter at high altitudes, and when needed, kind of swoop in and drop some bombs on targets. Very similar to kind of what we got going on, or what we've had going on for over a decade in Afghanistan. We've been using the B-1 bomber lately these days. B-1 is able to fly very, very fast. You can have a couple B-1s kind of orbiting and attack anywhere within the country within a short period of time. But namely, the B-52 helped save some remote outposts like Khe Sanh. It was a Marine outpost with a couple thousand Marines, South Vietnamese troops. What Khe Sanh was basically a fire base where they had a bunch of artillery pieces and infantry. We had these fire bases kind of scattered throughout South Vietnam. It was kind of in an effort to have these outposts out there to draw the Viet Cong out of the jungles with kind of a target to attack. Essentially, Khe Sanh was a base though that got cut off and surrounded by tens of thousands of troops versus the roughly 2,000 to 3,000 American and South Vietnamese troops. And with close air support from aircraft like B-52s, they were able to hold out. And you see there, literally, B-52s, big clunky bomber, dropping bombs within a couple hundred yards of U.S. troops. So B-52 largely credited helping save Khe Sanh, but also in 1968, the Tet Offensive, when dozens and dozens of cities in South Vietnam were attacked by communist forces, they were able to help support troops on the ground there, as well as repelling the Easter Offensive in spring 1972. The combat aircraft were not the only ones who kind of made the mission happen. Airlift also played a huge role in Vietnam. So just kind of want to differentiate here between tactical airlift and strategic airlift. So those of you in the class last semester, what do we typically mean when we're talking about anything at the tactical level? They were
more like specific battlefields or specific fight, not like a whole region.
Okay.
Theater.
Okay, and what are we usually talking about strategic then?
I think more like theater.
Okay, so kind of applying that to airlift. How would you, in your words, how would you kind of describe maybe what tactical airlift is versus strategic airlift?
Maybe tactical airlift would be using it when needed or like when the event arises.
Okay.
Yeah, it's maybe resupplying a fire base with ammunition and food and stuff like that would be more tactical, whereas getting whatever troops or bombs just to the theater could be more strategic.
Okay, very good. both of those were very, very good answers. So, and very correct. So, tactical, kind of just think small battles, small outposts, whether that be landing helicopters or smaller aircraft, on dirt runways, or airdropping supplies into forward operating bases. These fire bases kind of scattered throughout the jungle. Where strategic airlift, and it's funny, you can even compare the size of the aircraft. Tactical airlift are usually much, much smaller. You're not going to land a huge, ginormous, multi-engine, jet like a C5 Galaxy or a C141, on a dirt runway, where you could do that with one of these small propeller-driven aircraft. Strategic airlift, on the other hand, is kind of bringing in supplies from the United States or wherever else in the world in large quantities. So, whether that be just bringing in fresh troops from the United States or from the rear to Vietnam, or bombs, ammunition, whatever the case is, just to bring it to Vietnam, kind of as a staging presence. So, but when it actually came to resupplying troops out in the field, that would be done by tactical airlift. So on the oh yes.
Just a small question.
Yeah, you bet.
Who was allowed to call in?
It kind of, so we do it in a couple different ways. Obviously, people can call in like, hey, we're out of ammunition, and really that's kind of handled centrally. Like nowadays, it's handled kind of centrally in the United States. Any requests for larger resupplies are kind of handled at a hub down in St. Louis, actually, where they coordinate all the airlift kind of worldwide. Now, if it's kind of like, hey, we're out of this outpost, they may just call, the closest base and say, hey, we need you to lift this stuff. But kind of more at the bigger level, we need to coordinate. The Army needs us to coordinate bringing these tanks over to Afghanistan, for instance. That all gets done kind of centrally, where they kind of assign out that airlift then to the field and say, okay, well, this base out in New Jersey, pick up those tanks and take them over. So,
Okay, but is that more of a strategic?
yeah, that's kind of more at the strategic level. At the tactical level, it is kind of more within the theater of operations. So, kind of, either for the Vietnam example, it'd either be kind of within Vietnam or from bases in Thailand, or kind of the surrounding area there. So. But at the strategic level, we used a couple different aircraft. Again, you don't need to know too many specifics with this, but C-124 Globemasters, C-133 Cargo Masters, and more namely, kind of aircraft you may have heard of, C-141 Starlifters. The C-141 was the predecessor, large, basically jumbo jet aircraft. It was the predecessor to the C-17, and then we also used C-5 Galaxies, which are still around today, and they still break a lot today as well. And the big reason, kind of for that's at the strategic level. The reason we needed so much strategic airlift was the South seaports were generally not the best, so it was hard to bring in a lot of supplies by ship, which is traditionally what we do for large quantities of supplies. Additionally, it made it difficult with kind of uncertainty of the security of different roads and ports. Again, we were fighting a guerrilla force that could kind of attack at any time, so it was a lot of times it was just a lot safer to use some of these large aircraft to bring in supplies to the theater of operations. And then kind of at the tactical level, with these roads not being certain, with jungles kind of hard to navigate, tactical airlift was used to move supplies and people to forward operating bases. So we use large helicopters, such as the infamous Huey, and then some cargo aircraft like you see there, the C-123, C-7, kind of more the infamous C-130 Hercules as well. And when there was too much fire from the ground, or there was no landing area to land to unload supplies, that was kind of when we would resort to airdropping supplies. So, anybody seen Operation Dumbo Drop? Old Disney movie? One person. God, I'm getting old.
Did you say Dumbo?
Yep, it was a operation. Evidently, it was inspired by a true story.
They dropped an elephant.
Yeah, some village needed an elephant high in the mountains of Vietnam. So
To like pull stuff. Alright?
yeah, they kind of used it like a mule or a horse to pull stuff. And so the U.S. Army and the U.S. Air Force dropped an elephant in. And then they misdropped the premise of the movies. They misdropped the elephant. And these two Army soldiers have to lead it through the jungle to this village. It's an actual movie, so.
Plane. They used a helicopter. She's like, did they just drop it like out of the plane? Like
No,
they
it had a parachute.
Yeah. It was alive.
It was a little Disney vibe. So. Anyways, but again, tactical airlift was kind of the lifeline. That combined with close air support was often the lifeline that kept some of these remote outposts, like Quezon, alive and thriving. Okay, not going to talk too much about it, but reconnaissance was also a major mission, important mission within Vietnam. You kind of see some aircraft up there. Big thing I like to point out with aircraft is these were basically outfitted aircraft that used to do other missions. So the R in front of the aircraft designation, anybody want to guess what that stands for?
Reconnaissance.
Very good. See, it's like self-explanatory. But then that second letter would be kind of the regular designation of the aircraft. So an RF-4 would be an outfitted F-4 fighter with reconnaissance equipment. And then the RB-57, RB-66, those were basically old bombers that were outfitted with camera equipment, sensing devices, infrared photography, those kinds of tools to help us spot the enemy on the ground, see where they were moving troops and equipment, things like that. Yes.
On the previous slide, what does the C mean?
Okay, that means cargo. So yeah, anytime we're talking any C aircraft, that's always cargo. So I'm trying to think any other aircraft we didn't discuss yet. That might
And the UH is something helicopter.
H is helicopter. I'm actually not sure what the U stands for. That's an Army thing. Yeah, I think utility. So the Huey, we don't have a picture of it up there, but basically they could outfit the Huey with those did different missions. So either just transporting troops to the front. They could be outfitted with stretchers, gurneys, stuff like that for medevac missions. And then they could also outfit them with extra machine guns and forward-firing rockets as well, and use them on attack missions. So, good utility. I like that. We'll go with that. So again, this kind of era we saw, aircraft kind of not being used for their primary missions. We talked about B-52s. Primarily, they were designed as nuclear bombers. We were using them for conventional bombing, interdiction, close air support, those kinds of missions. The F-4 Phantom fighter aircraft, we were using that, during Rolling Thunder, essentially on bombing missions. We used them for reconnaissance. So very, very adaptable platforms. So not only would we use these to gather information about the enemies and help select targets, we could use these reconnaissance aircraft to go back afterwards to kind of check, okay, did we hit all the targets we need to do post-attack reconnaissance as well. And this paid off heavily during the Tet Offensive of 1968, again when the Viet Cong in the south raided several cities, helped us give a good sight picture of everything going on. All right, almost through the air missions here. Next one was combat search and rescue. So if you were a pilot in Vietnam, would you feel good about having a search and rescue mission? No? Yes? Yes. I think so. Knowing that if you were shot down, that every effort was going to be made to save you before you would fall into enemy hands. So this was kind of the predecessor to the PJs, the pararescue folks today. You know, they went by the slogan, you know, that others may live. So you know, they will do everything in their power to save their fellow man. So this increased aircrew morale by knowing that every effort would be made if you were shot down. Early on, and I think this is what some of you who are shaking your head were thinking, you know, we did not have these tactics refined. We were kind of unprepared for this mission upon entering the war. Again, we did not realize that we were going to be in this war so long and how big of a role search and rescue would play. So initially, we were only using ordinary helicopters with kind of basic tactics. However, later on in the war, we would put together essentially packages of aircraft on these search and rescue missions. So not only would we send in these helicopters to get our pilots or even you know, wounded ground troops out, but we would send close air support aircraft in, forward air controllers, basically a whole slew of aircraft just to kind of make sure that the rescue went well. Other aircraft used were C-130s were actually outfitted with air-to-air refueling capabilities. So they would actually go out and refuel helicopters. It's called a drogue and basket technique. So basically they sent this little basket hanging out the back of the aircraft, and helicopters would have this basically probe that would hook up with it and basically suck gas from the C-130. And we actually still have aircraft today that perform that mission. You see some aircraft there, the HH-53s and the HH-3s. So we actually just kind of retired the HH-53s in the past 10 years or so. Kind of largely been replaced with the Osprey, also a Transformers aircraft. You kind of see the impact there at the bottom. So by 1973, the Air Force had rescued almost 4,000 you know, downed pilots or wounded troops on the ground. So very, very, very important mission. Another important mission was air-to-air refueling. So I talked about last slide with the search and rescue mission with helicopters. We were actually able to use C-130s with the drogue and basket technique to refuel helicopters. And then for fixed-wing aircraft, we used the KC-135s. And the K before C, it just means air-to-air refueling. I think it means, I don't know if it meant kerosene back in the day, but that's just the I don't think it means kerosene, but that's how I always remembered it. But see, this KC-135s, originally those were kind of designed in the early 1950s. What's interesting about that is kind of their sole mission initially was to be able to refuel B-52 bombers that we had on alert status that could reach out and bomb the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons. So that was like the original kind of purpose in our building KC-135s. But obviously that aircraft has proven itself again and again and again. We're still using some that were built in the 50s and 60s. So there have been like several generations of fathers, sons, and daughters who've flown essentially the same aircraft. So, anybody from near Milwaukee? No, nobody in this class. Okay, well they have a KC-135 unit actually at the Milwaukee airport with the Wisconsin Air National Guard. So just some fun numbers up here. You don't need to know them, but just huge numbers of sorties. So really, you got to think about any time there there were those fighter aircraft going, on those interdiction raids or those close air support raids. Anytime we had reconnaissance aircraft going on target, and even these helicopters, there were always kind of refuelers there in the rear to always be there to help refuel, to get either to help get the aircraft to their targets, and then they'd be there on the way back as well to refuel them on the way home. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay. And then just kind of one last mission. We didn't really have a whole lot of dedicated platforms to this, but command and control is another mission we accomplished using U.S. aircraft. Essentially, command and control is just kind of helping us keep big picture eyes on the battlefield. So, kind of in today's terms, those are the people flying in the AWACS type aircraft. People kind of getting feeds of different reconnaissance and helping manage the battle scene. So, kind of up in the air, they would have powerful radars that could kind of see the entire battlefield. See where the refueling aircraft were at, where the attack aircraft were at, and help people navigate people to and from their missions, control the battle space as necessary. In a sense, it's kind of like being the air traffic controllers up in the air, kind of helping manage what aircraft are where. In essence, many times also just to prevent mid-air collisions as well. All right, so we're going to finally kind of get into more depth on each of the air campaigns. Probably just get through Rolling Thunder today, and then get through Linebacker 1, Linebacker 2 next week. So again, by the time U.S. really got heavily involved in Vietnam, it was clear that that the guerrilla warfare in the South by the Viet Cong, they were not acting alone. They were getting supplies from the North. It was getting supplies from both China and Russia. So the Johnson administration began to focus, on cutting off these supply routes to stop the Viet Cong in the South. There was a huge disconnect, though, between the way the military wanted to solve this problem and the way the civilian administration wanted to solve this problem. So put yourself in the shoes of the military at the time. What would you do if you were calling the shots to stop the flow of supplies from North Vietnam to South Vietnam?
Stop at the source.
Okay.
Go up into Vietnam where they're starting the convoys from producing whatever and hit it there.
Okay.
I'm not sure now what to do that then. I'd say probably make a border crossing.
Okay.
Would you do that?
Good.
Well, you said north and the south, so there's a flying south.
What was that?
You said, sorry. You said it supplies from the north to the south, so the north supplying the south.
Yes.
Well, like what are they supplying them with?
Weapons, ammunition.
It's like the
food.
It's the troops in the south.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, never mind. You're saying like here it is. Yeah, I do it. Exactly what you said.
Okay.
Just road crossing.
Okay. All right. So the U.S. Air Force, had they had their way, we had a strong doctrine, a strong tradition of strategic bombing. The Air Force wanted a short, very intense campaign that would clearly demonstrate America's resolve and attack the North's will and ability to wage war. So a little bit of kind of what everybody was saying. But again, that was the Air Force's way. Had the Air Force been able to, wage the war they would wanted, we would have just bombed all strategic targets in the North, basically crippling them and forcing them to kind of give up the war. Now, did we do that initially? 1965? No, we did not. The civilian administration, on the other hand, so, President, Secretary of Defense, civilian leadership in D.C., on the other hand, they wanted America's involvement to be very limited in the war and to avoid the possibility of any Chinese intervention in the war, because what war have we fought where the Chinese got involved? Korea. And we did not want that to happen again, because there's a whole lot of people in China, for those of you who did not know that. Yes, you know that, Kennedy.
Yeah, I mean, we know what was going on kind of back then. Like, I feel like no one knew. Like, I don't think, like, I did Eastern studies, and like China was in no position to like do anything from the 70s onward. They were just focused on like rebuilding China, and their army was like literally not even like functional.
Yep.
So I don't think even knew what China was doing at the time.
I mean, in hindsight, yep, you're absolutely correct. You know, they were allied with North Vietnam. They were giving them supplies. But again, it was just kind of one of those things. Everybody kind of had that recent memory of, 10, 12 years earlier when, 500,000 Chinese troops flooded from, China into the Korean Peninsula. So, that was part of the reason. Civilian leadership was very apprehensive to go after the North, kind of with everything we had. So they favored what we called a graduated response, which called for a campaign that would slowly increase in intensity. And the hope there was that the fear of future heavier bombings would cause the North to come to its senses and quit the war. Obviously, in hindsight, do you think that's a good way to fight a war? We'll just bomb them a little bit and see if they give up. And then if that doesn't work, we'll bomb them a little bit more. Okay, clearly no, because one of your principles of war is mass. All comes back, a little yellow warrior knowledge book for the cadets who they have to memorize stuff. This little knowledge book. And obviously that kind of takes mass out of the equation. So it also took away the principle of war of surprise. So the U.S. military was very much opposed to this gradualism, based on the fact that it did not take into account mass and surprise, and furthermore, it would not demonstrate U.S. resolve. So, the enemy would see this and just say, okay, well, we can wait them out. And lastly, it gave the enemy time to recover. So, any damage we may have inflicted to roads, railroads, they could be out there that very night rebuilding that stuff. So, furthermore, gradualism requires the United States to have patience. Does the United States have patience? No, we want it now. Darn it. So, very good. So, President Johnson, taking advice from his civilian leaders and the military leaders, he opted for the gradual response bombing campaign, which he called Rolling Thunder. Yes?
But the longer they waited in Vietnam, more chance loss. If you just wait for a long time, then they just wear you out.
That's exactly what they did, and you kind of see that evolve more and more throughout the war. So, not only 1964, 1965 when Rolling Thunder was kicking off, all the way to 1968, they were just kind of waiting it out. Remember, Vietnam had been ruled by colonial powers for on and off for a couple hundred years, and essentially that's kind of what they did with every colonial influence power that was there. They just kept fighting until whatever country that was occupying them kind of grew weary. That's essentially what they did with France about 10 years earlier. So we should have looked at history more and seen that this was not a ripe situation for success. Yep.
A bit off topic, but didn't they do the same thing in Afghanistan?
That's an interesting discussion topic. Yes, I would kind of agree that we'll talk about it more next week. We're going to kind of talk lessons learned from Vietnam. But what Vietnam taught us and what we should always kind of remember is we need to have a good, a good objective. What are we trying to achieve here? As well as, okay, once we achieve that, what's our exit strategy? What's our cue to exit? And how do we kind of turn power over to, whatever government may be in place? So we kind of saw that both in Iraq and Afghanistan. We went in, guns charged them, and then, okay, cool. Well, what's okay, yeah, we want to get effective governments running, but when do we kind of just cut ties and say, this war is yours? So yeah, we'll talk about that more. But yeah, excellent point. So, Rolling Thunder had a couple of main objectives, which you see up there: interdicting the flow of supplies from the North Vietnamese to the Viet Cong, and in turn forcing the North to stop supporting the Viet Cong and to quit the war. So, primarily, yes, we were cutting off supplies, but we were bombing some targets, essentially in the south regions of North Vietnam. And it was hoped by doing both of those that we would raise South Vietnamese morale, fire them up to kind of want to win the war on their own as well. So it was both a strategic bombing and an interdiction campaign. Again, a lot of these kind of were more of those kind of what we call tactical objectives, stopping this convoy from reaching, the south. But it was strategic in the sense that it was aimed at the North's will to wage war. So again, strategic does not necessarily mean, we're sending hundreds and thousands of aircraft up with the most powerful weapons. Strategic objectives can be aimed at just hurting enemy morale, whittling them down, wanting to fight. North Vietnam, though, did not have a whole lot of its own war production facilities, so not a lot of factories producing munitions, weapons, vehicles, things like that. So it did receive most of its war material from both China and the Soviets. So Rolling Thunder's targets were primarily interdiction type targets. Again, those supply routes, whether that be roads, railways, and even a lot of rivers and water routes were also involved. You see, we already kind of talked on our interdiction topic, some of the aircraft used, but there's a few more of them up there. All right, but thinking back to the video, anybody remember some of the restrictions on U.S. forces for what we could and could not attack?
We couldn't bomb villages and rice paddies and stuff, like agricultural things.
Okay.
You couldn't bomb their surface to air missile structures or anything in case we kill a Russian advisor or Chinese advisors.
Okay. Unless they were locked on us, actively firing at us. Yes.
You couldn't use missiles unless you identified.
Okay, very good. So when you would run into enemy fighter aircraft in the air until you had visual confirmation. And remember, that was kind of an issue initially because our missiles, usually by the time we could get that visual identification, we were too close to missiles. And what was the problem with the gun? It wouldn't exist. Yeah, we didn't have guns initially on aircraft. So, okay. Anybody remember anything else? We hit most of them. Cool. We'll talk about these. So obviously, Johnson administration control over Rolling Thunder was very tight, and a couple of those included MiG bases, so enemy fighter aircraft bases, and non-firing surface-to-air missile sites were off limits until early 1967. They did kind of let up on that a little bit later on in Rolling Thunder. Obviously, it was kind of too little too late at that point. No matter how much those MiGs or SAMs were hampering the effectiveness of Rolling Thunder. Like Lange said, dams, dikes, and hydroelectric plants were off limits to bombing, no matter how much the North used those sites for military activities. So a lot of times they would purposely position, some of these assets, some of these surface-to-air missiles, some of these anti-aircraft guns, either on rice paddies, on dams, on targets that they knew the United States would not attack because, for political reasons, it would look like we were attacking the local indigenous population. And then other other targets were off limits to bombing as well. So Hanoi, which was the North Vietnamese capital. Haiphong, which was basically the large port in the northeast portion of the country. Haiphong was where basically most of the Chinese and Russian supplies came in. So again, a very high populous area, but again, there was kind of the fear that this is very close to the Chinese border, and we were afraid of killing Chinese and Russians, as it was feared that that would expand the war. Furthermore, specific targets, numbers of sorties, actual flight routes, and types of weapons were selected by both Department of Defense and White House civilians, with only moderate input from the military. The inexperience of the civilians had the effect of making Rolling Thunder very unsystematic. So again, that tight control by civilian leadership. Because remember, military works for civilian leadership. Secretary of Defense is a civilian. President is a civilian as well. And there's a lot of, I haven't read a biography yet on Lyndon Johnson, but watched quite a bit on History Channel with him. He kind of he had a very rough go as president. Anybody kind of know any goofy kind of stories?
Didn't he make a lot of sexual?
He made a lot of off-color jokes, definitely for sure. It was rumored that he kind of would actually have some of his aides kind of, talking to him while he was either swimming naked in the White House pool or he'd be on the porcelain throne talking to some of his aides. Kind of a little, rugged individual in some of those regards, but really had a lot of issues from what I've, and again, this is just kind of from what I've read, watched, had a lot of issues. Almost insecurities as well, because really kind of an unpopular president. The Vietnam War was an unpopular war, as well as a lot of the civil unrest kind of at home with the protesters. Passed a lot of great legislation, civil rights, Social Security, welfare type programs, all that kind of stuff. However, Vietnam was kind of his black eye. As well as kind of just the large unrest at home, the protests, everything like that, where he kind of slipped slowly more into seclusion. That's kind of where he got a lot more hands-on. Just the more secluded he got, the more kind of hands-on he got. This was almost a distraction to him to be kind of selecting targets, getting more hands-on war. Yes.
Could you explain why there is civilian involvement?
Really, I mean, it goes back to the U.S. Constitution. So, President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief of the military, and then Constitution also called for Department of the Army and Navy. Later, we developed Department of the Air Force. So, basically, to make sure that the military doesn't get too powerful. It was kind of a good lesson learned, though, from Vietnam that, to a certain extent, we need to leave running wars, to the experts, to those senior military leaders who've been in the military for 20 or 30 years. So, interesting though debate, because even nowadays today, there's a lot of even Congress kind of tries to help dictate what the military does and a lot of stuff, and it's very complicated because they control the money too. So,
do you mean like to avoid a military leadership?
Not necessarily to avoid, just I think everybody's got an opinion about the way things should be done. And everybody wants to see things done their way, so it's just kind of lines get crossed. But we did do some restructuring of the way command was done. So again, I think we talked about a little bit last week. There's that 4-star general in charge of kind of running the war, where I think if there's a little less input necessarily, at least it's input to one man instead of input from this. From Washington D.C. to all these kind of different field forces. So, anyways, that's a good spot to end today. We'll wrap up next week with Vietnam. 2 weeks out, we'll have a guest.